Object classes. Object class. All anomalous objects, entities, and phenomena requiring special containment procedures are assigned an object class. An object class is a part of the SCP and serves as a rough indicator for how difficult an object is to contain. In the SCP universe, object classes are for the purposes of identifying containment needs, research priority, budgeting, and other considerations. An SCP's object class is determined by a number of factors, but the most important factors are the difficulty and the purpose of its containment. The following is most of what you will need to know to understand the SCP classes. Object classes. Safe. Safe class SCPs are anomalies that are easily and safely contained. This is often due to the fact that the Foundation has researched the SCP well enough that containment does not require significant resources, or that the anomalies require a specific and conscious activation or trigger. Classifying an SCP as safe, however, does not mean that handling or activating it does not pose a threat. Euclid class SCPs are anomalies that require more resources to contain completely, or where containment isn't always reliable. Usually this is because the SCP is insufficiently understood or inherently unpredictable. Euclid is the object class with the greatest scope, and it's usually a safe bet that an SCP will be this class if it doesn't easily fall into any of the other standard object classes. As a note, any SCP that's autonomous, sentient and/or sapient is generally classified as Euclid due to the inherent unpredictability of an object that can act or think on its own. Keter class SCPs are anomalies that are exceedingly difficult to contain consistently or reliably, with containment procedures often being extensive and complex. The Foundation often can't contain these SCPs well due to not having a solid understanding of the anomaly or lacking the technology to properly contain or counter it. A Keter SCP does not mean the SCP is dangerous, just that it is simply very difficult or costly to contain. Thormeal class SCPs are anomalies that the Foundation specifically uses to contain other SCPs. Even the mere existence of Thormeal class objects is classified at the highest levels of the Foundation, and their locations, functions, and current status are known to few Foundation personnel outside of the O5 Council. Neutralized SCPs are anomalies that are no longer anomalous, either through having been intentionally or accidentally destroyed or disabled. There are more non-official or one-time use classes. However, these classes make up the vast majority of SCP objects that you will encounter. Additional classes. Apollyon and other non-official SCP classes. Apollyon, used for SCPs that are impossible to contain or are about to irrevocably break containment. Apollyon is a non-official class in the SCP universe, however some SCP articles have used this as an SCP class. The classification was first used in SCP-927 on the Edit This Wiki in 2008. It essentially meant that the SCP was a particularly dangerous Keter. The original iteration of the Apollyon class did not appear in any additional SCPs, and was ultimately removed from SCP-927 by September 2008. The class did not appear again until 2014, when it was used in SCP-2317. Dr. Clef, the author of 2317, did not intend for Apollyon to be a serious object class. Rather, the class was meant to indicate that the SCP article was abnormal, and that the documentation was something hidden even from most of the SCP Foundation. Dr. Clef came to regret recreating the Apollyon class, and removed it from SCP-2317 in March 2018. Despite this, Apollyon has had a heavy influence on the SCP writing community. So although Apollyon class is not official as a class, it has been used, and sometimes removed as an object class, by the writers of some SCP articles. Most all the information in this video was taken from a post on r/SCP posted by u/D3RPG0 at about a year ago, when this video was made, and commented on by CoolDude971, with an excerpt from another post from 2 years earlier. Both pages will be linked in the description if you wish to read them. However, as they are both non-official SCP classes, I won't make a video featuring these classes. Please remember that SCP articles can often contain mature content. Please ensure that you keep this in mind before reading any information regarding the SCP universe. The Apollyon, Hemel, Archon, Shiamat, Yesod, Sananus and Guttal classes appear in more than one entry. Most of the remaining classes were essentially designed as one-offs. They have such specific criteria that they can't feasibly be reused. Cool Dude 971's list of non-standard classes. The class names are as listed in that poster: Apollyon, Archon, Azathoth, Sanunus, Challenge, Continua, Kabbalah, Darcelion, Declassified, Drigony, Ensof, Embla, Inchain, Eparch, Jevurat, Guttal, Hara, Hemel, Ignosi, Maxa, Mendax, Netsach, Newman, Principalus, Chronica, Cusum, Realatortsbrisha, Terminal, Shiamat, Truculent, Ticonderoga, Yesod, Zenzik, Zeno. As the SCP community is comprised of many writers, it is a possibility that any of the classes can one day be used as an official class. I will make an update video if this is entered into the official SCP wiki. Addendum: I would like to give special thanks to SCP Illustrated for use of the class list image shown. Please see the description for the links to SCP Illustrated's pages and other links mentioned. Thank you for watching. End of file.